All right, so Jordan and I are here talking about Difference in Repetition by Gilles Deleuze. Kind of like we're gonna read it, we're gonna discuss it. We're putting these videos out there just so that other people who are reading it, it's a really hard book, so the more resources everyone has, while they're reading it, the better. So before we get into the actual discussions, why don't we just do some brief introductions of myself and Jordan. So I'm Kevin Curry Knight. I'm a teaching associate professor at East Carolina University in their College of Education. I specialize in philosophy and history of education, but postmodern philosophy and particularly Gilles Deleuze's kind of outlook on the world um, interests me. So that's why I'm doing this. Jordan?
Hi, I'm Jordan Peacock. My main thing is I'm co-founder and founder of two startups. So Becoming Machinic does enterprise software and Sortilege is game design. But my undergrad and master's work were in philosophy. Specifically, my master's side was at European Graduate School doing continental philosophy. So I had some engagement with Deleuze through that process.
Cool. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit today about the introductory chapter, which, my goodness, I thought it was going to be like most introductions where it's like, here's what the book is about, here's what I'm trying to do. Man, it should have been the first chapter because it just reads like a chapter. So we're going to get into that. It's a tough reading. So why don't we start with some background on what Gilles Deleuze is trying to do? Because I don't know about you, Jordan, but I find that this book in particular is so difficult because he's using a language that we're all conventional, like we're all used to words meaning certain things and the outlook of the world being a certain way. I'm trying to challenge all of that using the language that most of us are used to within another worldview. Um,
Mhm.
so that's why it makes it tricky for me. So let's talk about what is he trying to do with this book project before we even start in on the intro chapter.
Well, and there's actually a couple really good resources in the English translation by Paul Patton that we're both using, which is that after the translator's preface, there's actually a preface from Deleuze himself, which I'm guessing was written towards the end of his life, and then the original preface. And both of those actually give probably what you were expecting from the introduction. Um, but in particular, in the preface, he gives this distinction between writing about the history of philosophy and writing about philosophy, because this wasn't his first book. Far from it. He'd done a number of monographs on other philosophers, Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, as well as some other things like on Satter-Masoch and I'm forgetting who else. But this was the first book where he says, I'm doing philosophy as opposed to doing history of philosophy.
Right.
And there's a really interesting distinction because for him, doing philosophy actually has a technical definition. And you and I are going to pull a little bit from this from his late work,
Yeah.
What is Philosophy, where he talks about this concept of philosophy as being the production of concepts. And so one of the major things that makes this book difficult, whereas like his book on Kant is actually quite straightforward, is that he's trying to basically invent a new way of talking about a new problem space that wasn't a problem space before. It was something that wasn't even an issue. And they kind of highlight this distinction because he goes back to people who kind of bumped against this. And he talks about Leibniz, who basically says, oh, these things are just this concept, and he moves on. Or Kant basically encounters this and says, this isn't something that anything meaningfully can be said about, so this is just outside of our purview. And Deleuze is saying, no, there's actually something there. Let's look at that. So you're in terra incognita in terms of you don't have predecessors who've explored this territory, and you're having to invent a kind of vocabulary. But the other thing that he's doing in this book and in others is he's trying to create a pedagogical structure where he's training the mind of the reader as well. And part of that means getting you out of the rut that you're used to thinking in.
Right.
And that doesn't happen except through difficulty. And
Yeah.
that's not to excuse some of the inelegant prose, but some measure of the difficulty is intentional.
Yeah, I feel like so one of the things I did before I read this book was I read a book by the philosopher Todd May called Gilles Deleuze. I believe it's just Gilles Deleuze, and trying to summarize kind of what Deleuze's overall project is, of which difference and repetition is part. And he explains it, and I've seen some other sources explain it this way. For most philosophers, especially doing metaphysics, the idea is there's a truth out there. It has to do with grasping the identity of things. Things are stable, so we need to get these stable ideas of what these things are. Metaphysics is our attempts to get there. And for Deleuze, first of all, he's some sort of process philosopher. Instead of things being primary and processes being what happens, among things, process is primary, and things are kind of constructed out of process and are kind of going through process. So it's almost like with Deleuze, the goal of metaphysics, particularly, isn't necessarily to get to the true nature of things. It's to figure out better and better ways to think about what we encounter, whatever that is. And it's probably not stable things. It's more, okay, we're acting in this world where things are not stable. Things change. Most philosophy can't account for that sort of change. We want to create a philosophy that can account for living in that change.
Well, and there's very much, I'm agnostic on the truth or falsity of his or any metaphysic, but you can definitely see where I think there's kind of two major pushes that drove Deleuze in this direction. Part of it was the math and science opening up to outside structures, and so he gets into manifolds and ideas of virtual spaces and these ideas of possibility spaces, and where what is, or where the identity of something is a fragment of the full reality of the thing. And so he's trying to think of, well, what would the full thing be, of which the part that we're encountering is just a part, or where the stability of identity is a construction. Right. Well, what are the roots and origins of that? And then the second part of it was really he's coming out of, this was published in '68, and 1968 in Europe was very tumultuous politically, but a lot of that was actually coming out of the stability post-World War II. And that also had expressions in philosophy, because you had semiotics, you had psychoanalysis, you had phenomenology, you had structuralism. Post-structuralism and postmodernism weren't really categories at the time of this writing, but this was part of that movement in response against these boxes and Baroque categorizations that were failing at the margins. And you go, okay, at a certain point, there's diminishing returns in improving the model. At a certain point, you have to throw out the model and try again.
Right. So why don't we, let's go from here into an idea of kind of the basics of what Deleuze is doing in the introductory chapter. So I have a quote here that I think, at least in my view, kind of sums up, I think, what he might be trying to do in the intro. It comes from page 12 of the Patton edition, so those who are reading hopefully are using that edition. Okay, and it's kind of in the middle of the chapter, and he says, "This is why the comprehension of the concept is infinite. Having become other in the thing, the predicate is like the object of another predicate in the concept. But this is also why each determination remains general or defines a resemblance to the extent that it remains fixed in the concept and applicable by right to an infinity of things." It's really hard to kind of get that, but what I take him to mean, in some sense, you kind of alluded to it, is that you have this idea of I guess we had talked in an earlier conversation that wasn't recorded about the idea of the concept. And in some sense, the idea of the concept, if I remember right, being almost like a list of all the traits that would describe a particular thing.
Yeah, when he's using the term comprehension, that's, I don't think it's in modern use so much, but that's a term from logic of, these are all of the predicates that define an object, and then so maybe you say these are the set of predicates that define a chair.
Right. Right.
And then the extension of that is, here are all the chairs that meet this comprehension.
So in the most basic language possible, I feel like what he's doing in the introduction, as represented by this quote, this is very basic language, probably oversimplification, but the comprehension of a concept is infinite. We are a finite part of that experience, trying to capture that experience. We're going to capture parts of it. We're not going to capture other parts of it. And of course, the mistake is thinking that we're representing the truth of what is, rather than representing kind of a slice of what is, not necessarily an arbitrary slice of what is, but a slice of what is that could have been captured in a potentially infinite number of ways.
Well, and where he seems to go with this is he realizes the impossibility of that infinite process, and he's kind of goading us towards this recognition that there has to be some sort of selection.
Mm-hmm.
And where he differs from a lot of his predecessors is he doesn't treat this selection as intrinsically something coming from a human subject. In fact, most of his efforts is dehumanizing what would normally be subjective processes. In this case, like when he's talking about like a selection of will, it's not necessarily a human agent who's performing the selection.
Mm. That might be worth exploring then. So when we say kind of dehumanizing the selection, and it's not necessarily a human agent that's doing the selection, I mean, I don't know if there's anything in this chapter that kind of indicates what the alternative is, or if that's later in the book. But is there an indication of kind of what that means?
He will get into that later in the book, but yeah. An example of what he's moving away from is for Nietzsche, for example, the will to power and the will to an internal return are very explicitly driven by the subject of the overman. And Deleuze acknowledges that, but expands it, basically takes it outside of the necessity of the human subject and says, no, this is actually a structural thing that human subjects can partake in.
Right. So let's go into, when I read it, and I think you and I agreed in a previous conversation, that the introduction is almost structured it's like an exercise, and he makes 3 distinctions between things that are all really important to understand where he's going. So let me start with this first distinction that he makes literally on the first page of the introduction. He makes a distinction between what's that? Yeah, first sentence, right? Yeah. Makes a distinction between repetition and generality. Here's what he says. Repetition is not generality. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies their confusion is regrettable. And he goes on from that. That's on page 2. I don't know about you, but Deleuze uses words that we generally have a certain idea of what they mean in different ways than maybe we're expecting. So it took me a few pages to catch on that he's not using repetition in the way that most of us think of repetition. Most of us think of repetition as, well, there's this thing and it repeats and it's the same thing, and that's what makes it repetition, right? So it's not repetition if a different thing happens. That's not repetition. Repetition means the same. The identity of this thing is the same, and it happens again and again. That's what repetition is. For Deleuze, it seems like repetition is not necessarily that. Repetition is a sequence of events that have some resemblance, but not perfect resemblance, but we pick out certain resemblances, and there are certain differences. So in that sense, repetition is not generality. Generality is like the process of deciding what resemblances there are, but that's not repetition. That's like after repetition. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's treating that as the more fundamental, and in the later he says things like recognition are derivative of this. So he says repetition plus representation produce recognition. But he also gets into, when he talks about the nth power, how repetition is implicit in the first element, that you don't even need a series, that the first element already has repetition in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's going to develop that a bit more, but in a more metaphorical language, he talks about, the mask does not hide anything except other masks. There is no first term which is repeated. When people are trying to look back to the substance of a thing, or they're trying to look back to the form of a thing, or they're trying to find what is the initial cause of which these other things are derivative effects. And he's saying you have it backwards.
Right.
And part of that is also getting at, you and I talked a little bit previously about the concept of philosophers shadowboxing, and there's a lot of places where Deleuze is explicitly citing who he's talking about and who he's responding to.
Yeah.
But there's also a strong element where, and it only shows up very, very briefly in the introduction, and I don't know that it shows up anywhere else in the book. It's been a while since I've read this. But this is very strongly anti-Hegelian. And the key thing he's saying is we are dramatizing ideas. We are not representing concepts. And
right.
Moreover, that there's an asymmetry here of pure positivity, of pure affirmation. So there's no positive and then the negative and going back and forth in the dialectic. He's
right.
like, this is something that is unequal, asymmetric. There is only one side. There is no counter to it.
Right. I mean, for Hegel, it's the concepts, the ideas are kind of driving what happens. Whereas for Deleuze, the ideas, the concepts are kind of derivative of the interaction of what happens and observers within the event.
So when you were talking about repetition is not generality, what was it that stuck out to you about that contrast?
Well, I had a hard time thinking about that because, the common sense way to think about it is they're not really much of a contrast. To say that something repeats is to say that it can be generalized. So it was really hard for me to kind of figure out what he was getting at, and it took me 2 or 3 pages and some of my prior knowledge about what Deleuze's overall project is to really get it. Okay, by repetition, he does mean kind of events in consequence that include difference and potential resemblances. So the example that I thought of, I always have to figure out examples to kind of flesh out in my mind. But the example I thought of, when we think of repetition, we usually think of repeating the same thing over again. The film Groundhog's Day, where Bill Murray repeats the same day over again. And the first example that stuck out in my mind was, you could think about when we get up in the morning, we all have a routine, and sometimes we deviate from that routine, but mostly it's the same. For some people, you get up and you go up and you put on the coffee maker, and then you go to the bathroom and use the shower or whatever. For other people, you go straight to the bathroom, brush your teeth, whatever. But generally speaking, we all have some thing that we repeat, and we think of that as a repetition. But I think what looking at it in the Deleuzean framework would say is something like, okay, what's happening is there's events that are repeating. They're consequent events. Every morning is a consequent event. It's a new event, and there are things that are similar between each event, but there are also a lot of differences between each event. So if you come out to the coffee maker in the morning, you don't take the same number of steps in the exact same place. You're not wearing the same shirt. You might get up at different times each morning or whatever. There's a whole bunch of things about that event, and there's a potentially infinite number of things about that event that could describe that event. And what you're doing is you're selecting some as kind of the important salient ones. You're saying, because these salient ones are common to all of these events, I'm going to say that this is a repetition. Whereas Deleuze is using it a little bit differently than that. He's saying, well, the repetition is everything. You're selecting out certain things, and that's generality.
Well, and there's a couple things that really strike me as potential misunderstandings to be avoided, and I think one of them is the idea that if you're positing a metaphysics, to a certain extent, what you're doing is non-empirical. You're not going to necessarily have the tools, or the tools may not even exist to formally assess some of your claims, but that doesn't make metaphysical systems inert. And there are different kinds of actions that come out of play if I believe in a kind of pantheism, for example. If I believe that there are spirits intrinsic in all the objects around us, I actually act differently and I think about the world differently. If I believe in a purely deistic clockwork universe where everything is, God wound up the clock and left the universe and it's just ticking away mechanically, that's a different kind of universe that actually changes some of the ways that I think and interact. And Deleuze is actually very closely working with the maths and sciences and is trying to posit a metaphysical system that says, what about these other framings that actually talk about the creative possibilities that are intrinsic to reality? What happens when you take things out of transcendental explanatory systems and you make the creative powers immanent to the things themselves? Mm-hmm. And so in a way you're removing this idea of there's an external God or there's an external thing that's giving you all these creative powers. He's saying, no, these creative powers actually develop from the things themselves, intrinsic to themselves, mm-hmm. immanently, and how do they unfold? And so when he starts getting into the questions of fetal development or questions about possibility spaces and manifolds or some of these other things, a lot of it's all looking at how do you do away with the box? And when he keeps coming back to like Newton versus Leibniz, a lot of that is, how do you get away from the concept of space that has an external absolute framing? How do you go with an immanent conception of space? Mm-hmm. And so this idea of, in fact, he has a later book called Pure Immanence. And so there's a degree to which this is looking at what are the seeds of identity that are, identity is coming from its own internal creative potential, and that potential is this difference in repetition. Mm-hmm. And from that, we get these things that we assess as stability of identity. But the side effect of changing your metaphysics in this way isn't that, oh, now I have the correct metaphysics, but it's creating this idea of understanding the possibility of change from an intrinsic immanent perspective. And when people treat that sometimes as being counter-science because it's not making an explicitly testable claim, there's two big things that he does respond to on that. And one is right in that generality where he's talking about repetition being against natural laws. Mm. And it's because there's an unacknowledged selection effect. When I'm looking at a physical property or entity, it's not just, passive observation, but I'm constituting an experimental context. And I'm choosing, like, these are the salient factors that I want to test around. These are the things that are excluded from consideration. Right. And that in itself is a prior judgment coming into the experiment. Right. And, it reminds me of in Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. Yeah. He talks about Galileo and how the big issue with Galileo wasn't that he was, putting forth these new claims, but he was also simultaneously putting forth a new means of assessing claims. Mm-hmm. And, if you use the old means of assessing his claims, they didn't work. And the old claims were better. Right. You had to take the new data and the new means of assessment. And when you're creating a concept philosophically, you're changing, you're not getting a different answer from the same question. You're changing the question. Right. The old means of assessment don't even necessarily apply. They're not even wrong. Right.
Yeah, the one thing that I wonder about, based on what you said, is whether Deleuze would agree with the idea that the change is intrinsic to the thing. What fascinates me about Deleuze is he seems to reduce any talk of intrinsicness at all. It's always a constellation of factors. It's the thing, if we want to call it a thing, plus its interaction with a whole bunch of other processes and things. So when you're talking about
thing was not the right choice of words for that, but we'll get to defining singularities and stuff later.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about kind of Deleuze's idea that the idea that natural law is constant needs to be kind of rethought because there's a selection effect. The example I always like to think of is it's always frustrating to me when I hear scientists and journalists, mostly journalists, say science shows that, and what's going on with social media shows that we're tribal. And we know that we're tribal because look at all these experiments where we rigged an environment where people were supposed where we're supposed to get tribalism as a result. And
Yeah.
look how tribal they are. It's amazing. People are tribal. Right? That study where they divided kids into two camps, like with two different color flags, and they saw that they were tribal. But what the journalists don't show is the selection effect. We designed an environment that was almost designed to nudge them to be tribal. So the best you can say is that people are tribal when the environment provides an outlet,
Yeah.
makes tribalism sensible, and they're not tribal in cases where you don't have those environments. And I feel like that's a really kind of almost Deleuzean idea. It's always interactions between things. So yeah, when you think about humans are tribal, that's just an intrinsic property. There's a whole lot that goes on to making that look like an intrinsic property that we don't generally look at because science likes to control for variables and things like that.
Yeah, and none of that is to say that like science is wrong or
Right.
bad or anything like that. But it's a in fact, I liked how Kevin Kelly, I think it's in his book What Technology Wants, he
Yeah.
lists like 14 or 15 tools of science and how they're used, and they all have pros and cons, but they all help with this. How do I make testable claims and have a feedback process?
Right.
Um, the thing that is kind of still on the generality idea that I want to touch on briefly
Yeah.
is he does a really interesting jump, and he does this a number of times in the book. But right out of the gate, he jumps from natural law and the idea of like laws of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
and he jumps to moral law,
Mm-hmm.
and he basically says moral law and the whole concept of moral law is in fact derivative of natural law, and if we undermine natural law, we also undermine moral law.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he talks about repetition against moral law, he's basically saying, look, the ground isn't there for that, and that ethics is a kind of singularity. And he'll get more into that, but the thing that really strikes me in that jump, and by pulling from both Kierkegaard and Tagore and Nietzsche, but then going into novels, Borges and
Yeah.
this is very much a continental philosophy thing where there's a very strong engagement with the arts and this idea that the arts actually have things to say philosophically. And so you pull from poetry and architecture and music and cinema and theater, and it shows up already I lost track of the number of times, but I think we have theater, poetry, literature, music, all represented just in the introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And saying like these are actually meaningful things that you can pay attention to, and that will actually give you valuable insights that you can turn into meaningful philosophical commentary.
Right. Right. So let's move on to then the second distinction that he makes. So the distinction with repetition is, and generality, is that repetition is kind of the sequence of events. Generality is the creative act almost of kind of figuring out what parts are salient to call it general. So there's a second distinction that follows from that, which is the distinction between three different types of what he calls blockages. And blockages kind of means what it sounds like, which is there's us, there's the world. Of course, we're a part of that world, but we're trying to kind of make sense of, in an active way, the world. But he says there's kind of three blockages that prevent us from any full ability to do so, any ability that's exhausted. And the first one he calls there's a nominal blockage, a blockage due to nominalism. The second blockage is there's a blockage that's due to nature. And the third one is there's a blockage that's due to repression. So why don't we tackle these in order? Nominalism is probably the easiest one to understand, which is almost like every attempt to describe, and I'm kind of getting this from I mean, Rorty makes a similar claim in some of his work, so I'm kind of, I guess they're bleeding together. I think they're both saying the same thing. That every attempt to say something about something is a description of relations, either between you and the object or the object and something else. So when I say the wall is red, that's really a description of the relationship of the wall, the light, and myself. So it's, and since we're all going to describe from different locations, and we're all going to look at different relationships in our descriptions, there's no way that one description could establish an exhaustive claim to being the way things are.
So I actually think that's an example of the artificial blockage of including predicates,
Oh, okay.
where there's a sense of alienation from nature because I don't have a grasp of the infinite in the thing that I'm trying to describe, and this attempt to create a set of trees or whatever it is that I'm trying to describe is always inadequate, and it produces that kind of alienation. The discrete extension, he gives the example of atoms and words, both of which are seem to be very, very clear and obvious sets, and I don't think he explicitly draws this connection, but he talks about Epicurean atoms, but there's an implicit tie to Leibniz's monadology as well, which is that at a certain point, if you have the same thing, if you have two copies of the same thing, you're actually talking about the same thing. And there's not really any available concept to talk about things where there's a sense of identity, but there's in fact a difference. Mm-hmm. And so there's a sense in which we feel like we prematurely understand difference through the use of words being used in different places in the text, or all carbon atoms being the same. And he's saying like those are things, but those are second order things. Those are not the root of what we're trying to get at. And so to the extent that it gives us a premature feeling of a premature grasp on it, it actually closes off the pathway to understanding.
Well, this is an interesting one because in a previous conversation you and I had, we brought up some examples of from Kant, and then I think also from Plato, the idea that certain properties that we would call nominal today were kind of considered intrinsic properties. So the example I have is from the Theaetetus, the dialogue from Plato, where Protagoras is saying, humans are the measure of all things, that they are or that they're not. And Plato said, well, that can't be right, because if it were true, then two different people who experience the same breeze differently, the same breeze is hot and is warm and cool. That can't be right. Of course, to modern readers, we look at that, we're like, what do you mean that can't be right? Of course that can be right, because they experience it differently. Hot and cold, or warm and cool, are not intrinsic properties. They're relations between the person and the breeze. Plato, what are you thinking? And the annotated version of the dialogue that I have says that the reason this was troublesome to Plato is because in Plato's day these things were considered intrinsic properties. Mm-hmm. And that just strikes the modern ear as bizarre. And then I think you had an example from Kant with kind of the same.
Yeah, Kant had this attempt at rebutting Leibniz in defense of Newton, talking about the nature of space, and it was this idea that if I just have a hand existing in space where there isn't an absolute orientation, I don't know if it's a left hand or a right hand. And that example seems kind of laughable. Like, how does that disprove anything? Right. And really, what it gets at, I don't remember to what extent this is Deleuze. My introduction to Deleuze was by way of Manuel de Landa, and one of the things that he articulated really well was talking about properties versus capacities, which was really about intensive versus extensive properties. So an extensive property might be like length, right, or width or something, whereas an intensive property could be pressure. And a property of something would be like the geometry of a knife, whereas the capacity of something requires something else. So the capacity of a knife to cut butter isn't, the capacity doesn't exist outside of a relationship to butter. Right. And these are really coming from, if you read Spinoza's Ethics, there very much is an element of how how do you build, Spinoza famously writes, we do not know what a body can do. And that's not to say that there's a degree to which we can't understand things. It's this idea that there are all these innumerable relationships that we've only ever explored this tiny, tiny subset of, and we don't actually know what will happen when we put ourselves in another situation.
Right.
We realize a new capacity that only exists because we've been placed in this situation.
Yeah. It goes against a lot of the way we even talk about biology, going back to the example of people are intrinsically tribal. And look, we put them in these situations and they're tribal. My gosh, everyone seems to be tribal in situations, and you're ignoring the idea that well, they're not tribal except for the situations where tribalism expresses or tribalism comes about.
I had a friend on Facebook that posted something, and it was about the reactions to Darwinism, like Darwin's Origin of Species. And you had, who was it, Huxley, Darwin's Bulldog, and the rise of social Darwinism, and people saying, like, this is clearly what this says. And then you had Kropotkin on the other side going, actually, there's just as many examples of cooperation in the natural world as bloodthirsty competition,
right.
And there's a degree to which you're filtering out everything that isn't fitting, your perspective of nature.
Right. So it's not against science. It's not against the idea of biology. It's not against the idea of phenotypes having norms of reaction for a given trait. It's really just saying that the norm of reaction depends on a lot of factors that aren't just biological, to the point where we probably shouldn't be saying that there's any innate features just waiting to come out until we're in a situation where they're actually coming out.
Yeah, fitness is not a meaningful it's not intrinsically zero sum.
Right.
And it isn't meaningful in the absence of an environment. Like, something isn't intrinsically fit. And so when people talk about something like a coelacanth is as evolved as humans,
right,
and it's because of that, organism environment fit. And you're not taking this universal judgment perspective of we are more evolved.
Right. Yeah. So for nominalism, just to bring this part to a close, on page 23, one of the quotes I have that was really helpful. It says, for Deleuze, repetition must be understood in the prenominal. We must find the self of repetition, the real subject of repetition, the singularity with which repeats. For there is no repetition without a repeater, nothing repeated without a repetitious soul. So it seems like for Deleuze, the idea is that for anything to be repetition, there must be, in some sense, something kind of, I guess, bearing witness to the events and saying this is what the resemblances are between the events. So it's always dependent on some sort of relational status. So that brings us to the second, I guess, blockage that he suggests, which is kind of, again, a blockage between our ability to create exhaustive explanations, and that's nature. Okay, so here's what he says about this, and this is on page 14, about nature as a blockage. As such, they, and by which he means concepts of nature, are always in something else. They are not in nature, but in the mind which contemplates it or observes it and represents it to itself. This is why it is said that nature is alienated mind or alienated concept, opposed to itself. Corresponding to such concepts are those objects which themselves lack memory. So what I take this blockage to mean is kind of a reaction against intrinsicism, against the idea that what we're going to do is get at the true nature of the intrinsic properties of this thing that is kind of an independent thing. And we're going to explain the way it really is by getting the true exhaustive description of that thing. I think for Deleuze, first of all, it's not a thing, it's always in process. So that's slippery already. And then secondly, whatever that is, it's hidden from us because there's a myriad of ways to describe that thing. And
different writers have put the focus on different places. Someone like Derrida is like your grasp of the thing is inadequate. And I think with Deleuze, the emphasis is actually on the former. which is that, you know, even if you did successfully point to the thing, it's not just static. It's not just waiting there to be pinned by you. It's alive and moving, and you know, there's that creative potential there that's happening independent of you. And even if you
we're dependent on you,
or dependent on you, yeah. And so, you know, yes, you also have the inability to grasp it in fullness, but it's also not something that is just going to stand still for you.
Right. Yeah, it's I guess I interpreted this in the light of, like, you know, Taoist literature, from the Lao Tzu to the Shuangzi, and you know, the most famous line from Lao Tzu is, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao." Because as soon as you put, I mean, the idea generally is, as soon as you put it into words, you're fixing something that's unfixed, and you're reducing something that's not reducible. I feel like in some ways that's kind of a helpful way to think of maybe what Deleuze is kind of getting at with that blockage. Now, the third blockage that he goes through is that of repression. He gets into a whole lot of Freud. I think we can be basic on this one because, as you note, or as you noted in our previous conversation, he goes into a lot more about repression in chapter 2.
Yeah.
Can we talk briefly about why repression is a blockage, or how it's a blockage between us trying to, like, fix descriptively reality?
Yeah. So, you know, so he's engaging with psychoanalysis pretty closely here, and then later in the book. And I think part of the thing too for people reading now is to recognize just how pervasive psychoanalysis was in France in the 50s and 60s. Lacan was huge. Freud was a common name. Even today, like, it's funny how much you know, people dismiss Freud, but he had a lot of stuff that we use all the time. Just, you know, the concepts that were really, really solid have basically been absorbed into the mainstream consciousness and then extended and run with. And the stuff that hasn't been ends up being the stuff that gets tagged with his name. But where Deleuze is writing, first of all, it's something that all of his readers would have a fair degree of familiarity with. But then a second part of it is he's looking at, in Freud's own career, there's a series of movements where he's trying to figure out, like, what's going on when you have these tics. What's going on when you have these symptoms where you're, you know, I keep dating shitty people like my father, you know, or whatever it is. Like, why is this repetition happening? And, you know, at some points it seems like Freud is, you know, going the right direction, and then he seems to, you know, go back. And so Deleuze is kind of hinting at this, like, movement in Freud and this unwillingness to actually say that, no, the repetition actually drives the symptom rather than the other way around. It's not going back and finding, here's the originary trauma that triggers everything else. And I won't try to assess the truth or falsity of that claim, but he talks about how forgetting and the unconscious are both part of this creative generative process, allowing repetition to produce these effects. And yeah, he'll go more into that in chapter 2, and we can kind of dig into that more. That was my understanding of it.
So I guess in really plain language, if the blockage of nature is the fact that we can never get to that fixed description that we want with an unfixed reality, repression would almost be, we can never quite describe to ourselves all the things that we imbibe because our conscious awareness of them isn't really all there is. Is that, do you think it's like a fair simplified description?
I think that's correct, albeit incomplete. I think the emphasis of it isn't on what we're able to have in conscious awareness, but I think it's more about where are our actions coming from.
Oh,
and
right,
it's not about our knowledge of our actions, it's about what's generating our actions.
Right.
And what's generating our actions isn't our conscious mind.
Right. Gotcha. Right. Yeah, so those are the three blockages, the idea being that here are the three things that really prevent us from being able to have this kind of true depiction of the world that's exhaustive. The world's just not exhaustive like that. We're not exhaustive like that. So then there's a third distinction that he makes that kind of gets at the similar point of, reasons why we can't have the kind of exhaustive, essence-based, essence-driven depiction of the world that we want. And these are distinctions he makes that happen, quote unquote, between a sign and a response. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through these very briefly and then give the example that I thought of to help me with this really abstract idea and see if it's helpful. So, okay, so you have a sign and you have a response from the person who's kind of taking the sign in. And here are the three areas where that are responsible for the contingency of what happens between the sign and the I guess the observer. First of all, you have contingencies that are based on, generally speaking, the physical sign or maybe the location, the sign as it exists, let's say, to the observer. Then you have, so here he says on page 22 to describe it. First, there's a distinction in the object which bears or emits them and is necessarily on a different level. Then there's, I guess, contingency that exists within the symbol itself. So he says, secondly, I guess the difference is in themselves, since a sign envelops another within the limits of the objects which bears it. Third is there is also contingency in the response of the sign, the reception of the sign. And he describes it. Lastly, there's variation in the response that they elicit, since the movement of the response does not resemble that of the sign. So this is really abstract. So like I said earlier, I had to figure out, like, let me get a good example of an aspect, like a sign and an observer relationship to see where these three things happen. And the one that just popped into my head, for better or worse, is a relationship between stop signs and people observing stop signs. So the first is like, so there's contingency with the physical sign itself. And for this, you think about, like, when you observe a stop sign, it's not obviously always the same stop sign. You might observe a stop sign with graffiti on it. You might observe a stop sign that's where the artificially the sides have been kind of damaged, or like the angles have been smoothed out. You might observe stop signs in different countries that have different patterns for stop signs. I don't even know if that's an international sign. So there's a lot of different stop signs that you could observe. So there's contingency there. The second is the symbol itself, which is, well, I guess the symbol and its connection to other symbols. So you have different places you could observe a stop sign, and they would mean different things in those different places. So when I see the stop sign in the first intersection outside of my house, that's going to be different than when I see a little miniature stop sign on my son's train, little miniature train set that he has in his room, which is going to be different than the stop sign that I would observe in the antique shop, right? So you could argue that it's stop. But they're in three different locations, which means three connections to other things. So the sign means different things in connection with other things. Then the third is, of course, the response, which is the easiest that we can think of. So if I'm walking at an intersection and I see a stop sign and there are no cars around that stop sign, I just go through it. I don't stop because I'm walking and there's no cars around. That's going to be different than when I see a stop sign at an intersection where I'm driving and there are cars, right? So it may provoke a different response in me. But it could also be difference in response in terms of, like, maybe one day I'm particularly kind of pissed off and there's a stop sign I come to where on most days, if there are no cars around, I stop, come to a full stop because I know it's the law, and then I go through it. But there could be examples of days where I'm just kind of pissed off and I'm like, no, I'm kind of in a rush today. There are no cars around. I'm not going to stop for this. I'm just going to go through it. So even then, the response could differ depending on the context, which includes my attitude towards the stop sign and things like that. So those seem like three different areas where you could say there's contingency in the relationship between the sign and the response that's given.
Well, and there's a really interesting discussion. I know you and I both have some small children, and there's some interesting discussion in Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sanders' book Surfaces and Essences, where they're talking about like how do minds develop categories of thinking.
Right. So that's the book for readers. That's the book about their theory about kind of how we construct analogies and grouping based on similarities. Yeah. Okay.
And so I remember, we were talking earlier, and I was mentioning how my youngest, came up to our front door and he was like, "STOP, stop!" And he's looking at the mailbox and it says "post," right? But for him, it was, he had the right sign, but it wasn't the right sign. You had this gap between the stop sign that he had as an input and then like how he applied it. And we talked a little earlier about this, and I'll go back over it again with my undergrad focus was artificial intelligence, and I'm a bit of an artificial intelligence skeptic, but I wanted to really dig in and figure out like what are some of the constraints guiding development of and a lot of that looked at like how do we think. Is there any reason to think that trying to replicate that in a machine is a meaningful thing? But it's been interesting watching the development of different techniques, and a telling one was when the Army was trying to build out neural networks, and they would train it on surveillance photographs, and these photographs were of tanks and foliage with camouflage, and so they would try to have the neural network algorithm look at this photograph and determine is there a tank or not. So you give it a whole set and you say these ones have tanks, these ones don't. And once the neural network's able to accurately sort those, then you give it new data and you try to have it sort those. And the problem is you don't know what judgment or criteria it's actually using, right? So you don't know what the comprehension is of the idea, of the concept. And it turned out like they were getting just all kinds of garbage results, and they realized that the criteria that the neural network had determined to use based on the sample set actually had to do with the cloud conditions and not with the presence or absence of camouflage tanks. But that's something that we see now with machine learning techniques and other things like that, where it's rather than trying to have the rigid structuralism of the good old-fashioned AI from the 60s, it's now, okay, we're going to use these heterogeneous techniques that we're giving up a bit of control. And it's interesting that that movement happened kind of in parallel with this movement in philosophy away from we can have a determinative concept of thought and of reality. And in mathematics, it happened earlier. In mathematics, it happened in the 30s. You had Russell's and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, and you had what's-his-face set theory guy, and Gödel basically throwing a bomb and all that and going, this is why you can't have nice things.
Right. So let's see. I think we've broken down the three sets of distinctions that I feel like this introductory chapter centers around. Anything else that we should say that we haven't gotten to in terms of understanding of the introductory chapter and what Deleuze is doing, what the message is?
So the two things that I had kind of marked that were worth just pinning is that there's a line, I didn't write down the page number, but he talks about how singularities are pre-individual.
Yes.
So instead of having an individual distinct identity, he's saying like singularities are pre-individual. And that's actually referencing another philosopher named Gilbert Simondon, who's really fascinating and unfortunately only a little bit translated into English. My friend Drew is working on some more projects, and they published on the nature of technical objects. But Deleuze relies on him fairly significantly later in the book, and Simondon is looking at how does individuation happen, and he's looking at it from a philosophy of technology as well as of nature.
Individuation of things, or individuation in terms of like senses of individual people?
Individuation broadly, of which all of these other examples are subsets. So Deleuze is borrowing some of those concepts, and I do have Simondon here, so I might pull from that a little later when we get to that. The other, I guess I had two others. the other quotes were talking about the anti-Hegelianism.
Yeah.
Deleuze is saying we're looking for difference without negation. Which goes back to that shadow boxing thing. And then he also says concepts should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problem, which goes back to basically what he understands philosophy to be doing, which is that we're not creating a static concept for all time. We're creating a concept to intervene here, and our concept that we enter with may not be the concept that we exit with.
Right. Yeah, the difference without negation, that's an interesting one. Because I guess the point being that Hegel, when you see difference, synthesis, when you see thesis, antithesis, the idea is the difference at some point is negated, and that's just that's the flow of history. Mm-hmm. Whereas Deleuze, I guess, is fully content to say to let difference lie, and difference just is. It doesn't negate. It doesn't resolve necessarily. It just is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This and then I guess the individuation part. I mean, I guess there's probably some similarities with Deleuze and some other things that I've been reading for the past few years. I never know how much I'm reading these things in or not, but so the Buddhist apoha theory of identity. The Buddhist tradition doesn't think of identity as a primary either. Like that's a very Western thing. It's like identity is the problem of metaphysics, and oh, really? Because Buddhists never mention it. Yeah. And for them, its difference is a thing is always defined by essentially in relation to what it's not, which sounds like kind of sneaking identity through the back door, but I don't think they think of it that way, and it seems very similar to Deleuze's ideas. So it's like the only reason I can think of this particular thing as a shelving unit is because I'm differentiating it from other things, and I'm defining it in a certain way relative to the purposes I have for it. So it's always nominal. We treat it as individual because that seems kind of natural to do, but it's always nominal. It's always relational.
Well, and it's interesting.
From anything.
What feels natural can change.
Right, which is what he's up to.
Well, and it gets to. I grew up evangelical Christian, and I grew up fairly, traditional in that space. And there's a whole stack of presuppositions that when I deconverted, there was probably 6 or 7 years after I deconverted where I kept finding things where it's just like vestigial beliefs that were just, they were hanging around because I hadn't really thought through, like, oh, the implications of giving up on this conception of God also has implications in all these other second and third degree areas. And then it would come back when I would have conversations with people, and especially like when Deleuze is getting at the singularity of ethics and moral law as being, in a sense, opposed. And that's a very, very common one that I've encountered, where when you start talking about the possibility that there isn't just this like universal law out there that I just need to discover and get right, and then that's how everybody needs to live. When you move away from that, there's a certain kind of person that can't understand that. Like I'm not saying they have no ability to develop the capacity to understand it, but they don't have the capacity to understand it at this time. And I've had those conversations with friends who were in seminary, and I'm going like, how are you not understanding this? But it was because like just that possibility was completely outside. I think William James talks about like, live beliefs and dead beliefs. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where like the dead belief is I can't even imagine a version of myself coming to believe this thing.
Right. Which is so that's like the whole Deleuzian project is.
So he's trying to build that capacity in his readers.
Yeah.
Simultaneous with.
Yeah, which is why I'm really attracted to it. So I guess that probably should bring us to a close for this one. We'll get together at some point soon and talk about chapter 1, where he really starts kind of laying the framework for this philosophy. So cool.